Welcome to the Make You Famous podcast, where host Jeffrey Goldsmith talks with guests about fame and how to achieve it.
I'm your host, Jeffrey Goldsmith, and check out the book at makeyoufamous.co.
Hi, Geoff Dembicki.
Hello, Jeffrey. Thanks for having me on your podcast.
Sure. So someone hacked your Facebook account and they randomly friended me. And then I noticed that you wrote a book called Are We Screwed?
Yeah, this book.
Yeah, that book. And the CBC has covered you, and I'm sure you've gotten other press. I haven't really looked, and I haven't read your book, admittedly, because this just happens. But it's about climate change and whether we are screwed or not.
Mm-hmm. And
it looks to me like, yeah. What do you think? Are we screwed?
I'm not sure. I feel cautiously optimistic, but just to I really want to pin down the randomness of this whole situation.
Yeah.
Because like you said, my Facebook got hacked the other day, and I was locked out of the account for a couple of days, and then finally I regained access and came on, and whoever the hacker was had changed all the settings to Arabic for some reason and sent friend requests to people all over the internet. And so you were one of those people. And it, in a weird way, this hacker facilitated our conversation right now. It's totally random.
I don't mind. It's fine. Yeah.
Yeah. And I also like the spontaneity of it, but, I'm glad that you're interested in the premise of my book.
Yeah, I think about it every day.
About climate change?
Yeah, the question, are we screwed? I mean, I see what's happening, and I have kids who are probably not much younger than you. How old are you?
I'm 31.
All right, so they're a little bit younger than you, like a decade. But yeah, I mean, in 20 years, Miami may be gone. 1 billion people may die of starvation and air quality issues. It's really true.
Yeah, it's totally messed up. And when I was originally starting the research for this book, I found a piece or a research paper by the climate scientist James Hansen, and
right.
And
I know him. Yep, the guy with the hat at Columbia,
yeah.
Right? Yeah.
And he was saying okay, let's just look at the absolute worst case scenario. What if our predictions are too conservative? And he ran some models, and I'm radically oversimplifying his paper, but he concluded that if humankind basically does not get its act together and radically lower greenhouse gas emissions, we could potentially see the flooding of every coastal city on the planet within 50 years,
right.
Which is it's totally crazy. But it's an interesting scenario, because if you work backwards from the numbers, so 50 years, that's like 2065, work back from that, you're kind of at the upper age range of millennials for anyone who will experience this scenario. So if you're about 35 or so now, which is kind of the cutoff point, you could be in your mid 80s when Hansen's doomsday prediction comes true.
Right.
So we hear all this really cheesy stuff about millennials all the time, are millennials more into pizza or wine, or what are they doing? Are they ruining office workplaces, whatever? And this study kind of shows that that there is one generational divide that you really can't argue with. If you're 35 or younger, the odds are you're going to experience climate change much more directly than anyone who's older. And so that really got me thinking, what does it look like to contemplate the end of the world potentially as a young person? And more importantly, what can we do to sort of, fight back and create a better future?
Right. And so that's what the book's about.
Yeah, that's the starting point. But I didn't want to just leave it at, oh, there's all of this like terrible shit happening and we're screwed. I wanted to look at sort of the very real ways that the young people were fighting back, not just on climate change, but on a whole range of issues. And
Right. Yeah, because you can't just fight climate change. It's our whole consumer system. Plastic water bottles, automobiles, twisties, straws. I mean, if I see one more straw being pulled out of a sea turtle's nose, well, I mean, I scream every time. So it's like, I don't have to say it. I see it one more time. Every time I see it, I scream, right? It's totally messed up. And we don't need straws, right? Go ahead.
It's true. We don't need straws, and plastic is ending up in people's drinking water. And there's a whole bunch of environmental issues that are just kind of terrifying when you go down the wormhole of it. But it gets even bigger than that, because you look who are the richest industries in the world right now. It's oil, coal, and gas. It's companies like Exxon, whatever.
Right.
They can spend millions of dollars to influence politics. So you soon realize it's an environmental problem, it's an economic problem, it's a problem with our political system, and it starts to feel pretty daunting when you look at it like that.
No, because I mean, look, Rex Tillerson is the Secretary of State of the United States, directly from Exxon. It's like that's like massive influence, right? And the economic incentives for change are not there. It's like
they're starting to appear, and that was, so I knew just from writing about climate change that there's a bunch of big picture stuff, like Trump notwithstanding, that is very hopeful. So there's more renewable energy being installed every year than fossil fuel energy. Coal use in China is coming way down. Texas, amazingly, is the #1 producer of wind in the U.S.
Heard that. That's amazing.
And starting a couple years ago was the first time that people who measure the global economy had seen global economic growth go up a bit and carbon emissions go down a little bit. So those two things are, they're not tracking as closely as they used to, which, is the direction we need to be heading in. And so I knew that there was all of this really positive macroeconomic stuff starting to happen in a big way. And I was just interested. If you look at people my age, we've grown up with the Great Recession. There's a lot of questioning of our current economic system. I was curious, what does this value shift look like when it's put into action, and does it have real and measurable impacts? And it turns out it does. Young people are changing the world in very profound ways, not to sound, overly cheesy about that, but that was the conclusion I had from going around the world and talking to people my age. And I could give you a few examples of that if you'd like.
Please, yeah. Where did you go, and who did you talk to? And did you actually physically go, or was this online, or how did you research that?
No, I was all over the place. I was in Silicon Valley briefly. I was in the Alberta tar sands, Wall Street. I met oil and gas lobbyists in Washington, D.C. I was at the Paris climate talks, and I was explicitly, meeting people my age and asking them, what are you doing to sort of fight back and make the world a better place? And how are your values different from people who came before you? Right. So one really interesting example of the power of values to actually create profound change is this young artist I met, who grew up in the tar sands of Alberta. So that it's kind of like Canada's Texas, basically.
Yeah, exactly. There's all these water issues and stuff up there as well. I mean, the rivers.
Yeah.
It's a mess. There's a huge like holding tank that's the size of I don't know what, but I saw a documentary or something about that. It was horrific, actually.
Yeah, it's nuts up there. And I was speaking with this artist. He now lives in Brooklyn. He's a conceptual artist, and he grew up in the heart of the oil patch, and for years and years he's struggling to decide, am I going to work in oil and gas like my parents and grandparents, or am I going to devote my life to more than just a paycheck? Am I going to try to find some wider meaning in what I do and become an artist? And so after years and years of going back and forth, he decided, like, fuck it, I'm moving to New York. I don't care about earning the most money possible. And so you might think, oh, like, how does this one person possibly, make any sort of difference? But it turns out that there are millions and millions of other people in their 20s and early 30s who are making a similar decision. And this is starting to directly threaten the oil and gas industry. I
want to stop you on that point for a second. A friend of mine who works for Panasonic, he represents Panasonic in the United States. He told me about the young people in Japan. There's a movement to move out of Tokyo to these small towns and do crafts and make pickles and those sorts of things. They're like, this is ridiculous. So they're taking off and going to small, because I have a place in the country called Nevada City, and he visited me there on his way back from Reno, on his way back from the Gigafactory.
Oh,
right?
okay.
He stopped in Nevada City, and he's like, wow, this is like what the kids in Japan are doing, because they're anti-consumer. They don't want cars. They don't want all this stuff. They don't need to make all this money, because they've been in a recession since the late 80s, right? Early 90s, because that real estate crash turned the Japanese economy upside down. Anyway, sorry. But
that's interesting. No.
Give you a parallel, yeah.
No, that's interesting to know. I should definitely look more into that, because I was mostly focused on North America.
Sure.
But yeah, just to sort of to make that value shift real and to take it beyond sort of this like flaky realm of like values and whatever else. If you look at oil and gas, you need high levels of education and technical expertise to run an oil rig, to pull oil out of the ground. Massive training required for that, and most of that's expertise right now is concentrated among baby boomer workers. But in the next 10 or 15 years or so, most of those workers are going to retire, and so the oil and gas industry is desperately looking to bring a new generation of workers into the industry so it can keep expanding. However, it's having a very, very difficult time attracting young workers for some of the reasons we discussed, and a reporter for Reuters tried to tally up the financial impact of this labor shortage, and they estimated that a failure of oil and gas to get millennials working for the industry could block $100 billion worth of new oil and gas projects, which it's gigantic. And it just goes back to a simple value shift and to the stories of people like this artist who decided, I don't want to do this line of work. I want to make a break with my parents and grandparents.
That is a fascinating macroeconomic model. I think we should all short Exxon long term. They're going down because they're going to age themselves out of existence. There's a labor shortage in a lot of technical areas, but if they can't hire the kids, they're done.
Yeah, and I don't know how closely you follow the oil industry, but there was this crash of oil prices starting a few years ago, right. and so all of these companies had to sell off billions of dollars worth of projects and whatever. So they've been dealing with that. But before the oil crash happened, I was reading a lot of these companies' internal documents, and they were saying this labor shortage and our inability to get young people is like one of the biggest threats to our industry. It's terrifying to us.
That is fascinating. So, I mean, that's almost, so I'm a marketing guy, and part of book that I wrote about becoming famous, you could make a name for yourself because we say your book does not point this fact out. It's Are We Screwed? But there's this other story about how millennials can vote with their attention.
Yeah.
And vote with their skills and vote with their time and tell, you use the F-bombs, I'm going to use it. Fuck you to the oil industry. I'm not working for your lazy motherfucking asses. You know, it's like, I'm going to work for the wind industry. I'm going to work to put in, you know, tide driven energy. I'm going to work for solar. I'm going to, you know.
Yeah.
And if all kids did that, that would be that. The writing would be on the wall. The share, you know, all this, you know, the Wall Street would be like, whoa. You know, if you really shifted it, they would see the end is nigh. They'd sell off the stock. The stock prices would crash. It would just transform the industry. It'd be like what the world did to South Africa during apartheid. You know, you sell it all off.
Actually, it's interesting you bring up the apartheid example because there's a chapter in the book that deals with fossil fuel divestment, which is directly inspired by the apartheid campaign. And Wall Street is actually paying close attention to this fossil fuel divestment movement. And the reason for that is, a few years ago, a bunch of students, college students at Harvard and other Northeastern universities, they decided, hey, this campaign to end apartheid worked pretty well. Why don't we try applying that to climate change? And so it was only a few dozen students at first in the fall of 2012. And they thought, we're going to organize campaigns to force like Harvard and other universities to sell off their investments in oil and gas.
Right. I remember the Harvard story.
Yeah. And so it started to get more attention. And then these students were mocked by politicians and industry leaders. It was like, oh, this is impractical. You're being naive and whatever. You know, fast forward a few years, fossil fuel divestment has now influenced $5 trillion worth of financial assets worldwide, it's absolutely gigantic. And now I was in meetings with Wall Street executives, and they're taking this thing seriously. It was executives from Morgan Stanley and Deutsche Bank and whatever. They're looking at this and they're like, wow, a new generation of investors and activists and young people and entrepreneurs and whatever else are going to be running society with a totally different view on capitalism and the environment, and we have to prepare for this. It's still early days, but...
Right. But there's another book idea for you, right there. I mean, divest, right? Because it's divest from this system.
Yeah. I mean, it's a whole chapter of Are We Screwed? I get pretty deep into that. But I mean, it comes down to that question of values that I was talking about. So there's nothing too fancy about the divestment movement. It's very simple logic. If you invest in oil and gas, sell it off. But there's a moral worldview behind that, which says, you know, climate change is going to screw us as young people, in particular, and we don't think these investments in oil and gas are doing anything positive for us. We want to draw a moral line, and you need to be on the right side of it. And it turns out when you do that in enough places, it has a real world financial impact. I mean, we're talking $5 trillion worth of assets.
Mm-hmm. Yep. You know, I'd be happy to introduce you to my friend from Panasonic as well, if you ever wanted to take a trip to Japan to research that, you know, these kids. You just go out
that's interesting.
Yeah, go out to some village where they're all hanging out, like with changed lives. You know, yeah, I grew up in Shinjuku, and now I'm living in Wakayama Ken, you know, and learning about herbal remedies, right? A friend of mine's brother's girlfriend, her family has a traditional Japanese medicine shop that is like 1,000 years old outside of Nara near Kyoto. I mean, there's stuff to learn, right, out there, and stuff to work on. And there's villages that have been making pickles for hundreds and hundreds of years, and the people live like incredibly long lives because their microbiomes are amazing. So, you know, and all these kids in Tokyo are like, what am I doing? Why am I putting up with this? And I've actually 2 friends here for the J-Pop Summit who are staying with me, and they're like, and they have to live in the hinterlands because Tokyo is just out of control, like all of these cities.
Yeah.
Anyway, divest is the message.
And one other thing I'd like to highlight is, so those were kind of like 2 economic trends,
right?
That I really noticed. But you know, when you really get down to it, the big important stuff is political. I mean, obviously, as we saw with the election of Donald Trump, you can't ignore politics,
right?
But you know, that was a fascinating election, obviously, because you had Bernie Sanders totally take off, and he was, you know, written off as a fringe candidate. He's a socialist. We can't elect someone like that. And the reason he took off was mostly because of supporters in their mid to early 20s. There's some fascinating voter data I discovered about Bernie Sanders. In the 2016 primary, Sanders got more votes from 20-year-olds than Obama did in 2008. And we always talk about Obama as like the president of the youth. But really it was Bernie Sanders. And he got more votes overall in the primaries than Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump combined. And so people say, oh, you know, it doesn't matter, like we don't need to still be talking about him because he lost the nomination and like Trump is president and whatever. But it fits into a larger trend we're seeing in Britain this summer. Jeremy Corbyn made astounding gains for Britain's far left because of young voters. Their turnout was up at like 75% in some areas, just totally nuts. And before that, people have been saying, oh, young people have given up on voting, like democracy is over. But it clearly wasn't. And this Jeremy Corbyn guy came along. He said, we're going to take radical action on capitalism. We're going to fix climate change. We're going to actually do stuff in politics that helps society. And that message really resonated. And then in Canada, where I live, in 2015, we had a similar election. For 10 years, we had this conservative guy, oil and gas guy named Stephen Harper. And it was exactly like in the US and UK, all these people saying, oh, young people don't vote, their turnout is abysmal. But in the 2015 election, there was a surge of young voters. They're terrified about climate change. They wanted Stephen Harper out. And that was a crucial factor in getting Justin Trudeau elected. So politically, you're starting to see these massive shifts, not just in the US, but you know, across North America and even into Europe.
Okay. So the answer to your question, which is the title of your book, is no, we're not screwed.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, we're presented with so much like horrifying information all the time, and obviously the images of Hurricane Harvey are difficult to watch because you know that kind of destruction is going to become more and more common. But I have to say, even with all that in mind, I would say we are not completely screwed. I am cautiously optimistic about the future.
Okay. Well, that's good to hear that. I hope you're right. I really hope you're right, Geoff. And I hope your book has a wide impact. I sincerely do. A guide to divesting. Like, how do you say no to jobs that encourage the wrong direction? Someone says, hey, you can make $180,000 a year and do a little evil. How do you say no to that? When you're 28 years old, how do you say, yeah, no,
Well,
I'm going to go make, go ahead.
You make $180,000 doing something that's not evil, and luckily there are more opportunities to do that than ever these days.
Okay.
But you're right. It is about divesting. It's about divesting your career from things that are causing the problem. It's about divesting from political candidates that won't take our future seriously. It's divesting your actual investments. And luckily, there's more opportunities than ever these days to do that.
Yep. Yeah.
So I still hold on to a little shred of hope.
Okay, Geoff. Yeah, I do too. It's just there's scary, it's not just Harvey, but this hurricane season is going to be bad. The Arctic is not even ice-free, and it was record-breaking heat in San Francisco and Santa Cruz and so forth recently. People were blown away, and that's still with ice in the Arctic.
Yeah.
It could be 120 degrees in San Francisco in 5 years. A friend of mine came home from Iceland and found his one red wine bottle in his kitchen had popped.
Whoa.
Spontaneously. He posted it on Facebook this morning. And my comment was, quote, what is the world coming to takes on a whole new meaning. Really?
Well, I have to run, but I want to leave on one final note. And I would say, hope is not just this like fuzzy thing that lets you deal with all the bad stuff. I see it actively as an organizing principle and a way to bring people together and to sort of fight for the changes we want to see. And you do that fundamentally with hope. So hope is it's a strategy and it's a means of attack. And I think it's the way that we're going to get some of the changes that we need to see in the world.
I completely agree. Thank you very much for joining me, Geoff.
And thank you for having me. And thank you, nameless hacker somewhere out there in the universe.
Crazy, right? All right. We'll talk again soon. Thanks a lot, man.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening, and be sure to check out the book at makeyoufamous.co.